Welcome to Shadow to Soul. I'm Dejni, a regression therapist and a soul guide. On this podcast, I share real stories from my work. Stories that show what we carry internally shapes what we experience externally. This episode is about responsibility and what happens when we begin to carry more than we were ever meant to. This is an anonymized client who came in with a very clear concern. Aidan had stepped into a new business role. There was opportunity, there was increased responsibility, and with that, a lot of pressure. He was responsible for signing on large, important deals for his company. But they all seemed to be taking a long time to close. There was interest, there was activity, but ultimately the closure just wasn't coming. And with the long duration it was taking to bring these deals to a close, he started becoming uneasy. He questioned, am I doing enough? Is something going wrong? But underneath it all, there was a deeper question. Am I secure here? Is my position here safe? Because for him, delay did not feel neutral. It felt like something could slip away. And as he spoke, something became pretty clear. This wasn't something new. For him, this was a familiar feeling. On the surface, this looked like a work concern. But very quickly, it revealed itself as something else. A pattern of holding everything together, staying ahead of the possibilities of what could go wrong, carrying responsibility, even when it wasn't his to carry. And underneath all of that, a need to feel safe. Because when safety isn't fully felt, control becomes the way we try to create it. I carried this session slightly differently. With his permission, we didn't go looking for one moment. We allowed his awareness to go through every year of his life, step by step. And in doing this, it allowed what was still active within him to come forward. Because healing doesn't happen by revisiting everything. It happens by allowing what still holds charge to be seen differently. As we moved through his life, a pattern began to unfold. At 39 years of age, he was going through a period of transition, moving from something he had built into something that was more supported. Not having to carry everything alone brought relief, but alongside that, he felt a quiet disappointment. He felt he let himself down. His business hadn't unfolded the way he had expected. He had been living way beyond his means, creating a life that optically looked full, but didn't feel settled within. There was a constant need to stay occupied, to be out, to avoid stillness, because stillness meant feeling everything that he'd been carrying. In that moment, he recognized something. He wasn't moving towards something. He had been moving away from himself. And now with that awareness and understanding, of why he was constantly moving allowed him to return to himself. At 37 years old, he was in the process of closing his business. There was an intense heaviness in what he felt. He felt that he had failed. And as he continued to keep his awareness in that moment, he started to get clarity. He saw from a higher perspective that this was completion, not failure. There was no path forward for that version of his life. And when that was seen, the pressure to make it work, the feeling of failure that it wasn't, began to release. At 31 years of age, he entered a relationship full of conflict, full of resistance, with no one on his corner. He had to fight that alone. And here, something important separated the situation and the pattern, because this wasn't where the pattern began. This was where it played out the most visibly for him. The feeling of standing alone, having to push through, carrying everything himself. This had all been there long before. At 25 years of age, his mother remarried and moved away. And a strong feeling of, I don't belong anywhere, settled within him. He felt displaced, no anchor to anyone. And once again, as his awareness stayed in that moment, he began to gain higher perspective. He began understanding that her decision wasn't about him. It wasn't her abandoning him. It was her finding her own way. And once he began to see that and feel the truth in that, his experience of it shifted. It was no longer abandonment. It was movement. At 23 years of age, he lost a close friend to a car accident. With that, he carried a deep responsibility. He felt he could have stopped it by simply asking his friend not to drive at that time. And this was one guilt that had lived with him from that moment out of sight. That guilt turned into a belief of, if something goes wrong, it must be because I didn't do enough. In that moment, I encouraged him to go deeper, to connect to his higher self, to understand why it happened the way it did, and for him to see, was he truly responsible for this? And as he connected to that higher perspective, he saw the situation very clearly for what it was. There was nothing he could have done. The choice wasn't his to make, to get into the car to drive, and this was his friend's journey. He recognized that this was a responsibility that was not his to carry, and a guilt that wasn't necessary. And when that finally landed within him, he was able to release that guilt that he'd been carrying for over 2 decades. He felt an overwhelming sense of peace just within releasing that guilt. At 18 years of age, he had moved away from home for further studies. He didn't want to be there. He felt deeply alone, deeply homesick. And the sense of loneliness took hold of him, and he began to cope with it through overindulgence in food, in spending, in other distractions, creating fullness externally to avoid what felt empty within. When he was 15 years of age, he ended up in a car accident that left a lot of scarring on his face. He felt incredibly insecure with how his face looked. There was fear, but deeper than that, there was a shift in his identity, in how he saw himself and how he believed others saw him. In healing through this moment, he was able to restore his authentic sense of self. At 7 years of age, he was sent to boarding school, not far from where he lived. He felt abandoned, unwanted. He couldn't understand why he wasn't able to live at home with his mum when they lived so close to the boarding school. And here, the pattern became clearer. Not just the instability, but the abandonment. And to cope with that, he had to adapt. He became who he needed to be to belong, to feel safe, even if it meant leaving his authentic self behind. And here, in understanding the deeper why behind the decision that was made to send him to boarding school, recognizing his coping mechanisms, and also seeing the impact of those coping mechanisms, not just in the moment, but how they shaped the way he lived the rest of his life from that moment, he was able to release what he felt because of the experience. And he was able to get back his sense of identity and his sense of belonging. He recognized he wasn't abandoned. It was something that had to happen, in effect, for him to be safe and to have a fuller life. From this point came the earliest point in his life that held an active charge, when he was 2 years old. He saw his mom taking him in the middle of the night, without explanation, but with an urgency of being silent. He felt safe, but confused. He didn't know where he was going. In that moment, there was no understanding of the situation. It was just the experience of what he felt. And from that feeling, something formed. If things can change suddenly, I need to be prepared. If I need to stay prepared, I need to stay in control. And if I don't, something could go wrong. At this point, it was clear. This wasn't a series of separate experiences. It was one pattern expressed in many different ways. Instability leading to control, control becoming responsibility, responsibility becoming identity. And over time, this became the way he navigated through life. Consistent, automatic behavior, powered by the subconscious mind. What changed in this work was not the past. It was how he related to it, how he had perceived it, versus what the true reality of the situation was without any internal filters. At each stage that he had witnessed, he released what he had taken on that was never meant for him and reclaimed what was always meant to be his. At each stage, it was reclaiming his power, his identity, his authentic sense of self. And as that happened, something else happened naturally alongside. The need to control began to soften, because safety was no longer something he had to create externally. It was something he could feel within. After the sessions, aspects of his external life, external situation, began to change immediately, as did he. There was less urgency within him, less pressure. There was more clarity. There was stability. And as he felt this shift within him, there was movement. The deals that had been pending began to close one after the other, almost all at once. including one of the largest deals the company had ever seen in its history, a level of movement that hadn't been there before, and his presence at work came without the pressure he had carried before. Often what we experience externally is not about what we're doing in the moment. It's about what we've been carrying. And when that begins to release, we don't just change what we do, we change how we are, who we are. And from that, life begins to respond differently. If this episode with Aidan resonated with you, stay with what comes up. There is always more beneath the surface. Follow shadow to soul so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for being here. Until next time, from shadow to soul.